The 40 plus. Restart. Stop living the life you built. Start living the life you're meant for. Introduction. When the masks fall, who remains? There's a moment. You might have already lived it, or you're living it right now. When you look in the mirror and realize the person staring back at you is a stranger. Not because you've aged or changed in some dramatic way, but because for the first time in decades, you're asking a question you've been too busy, too distracted, too overwhelmed to ask. Who am I without everything I've built? Without the career that's defined you, without the roles you've been playing, without the titles and responsibilities and endless doing that filled your days and your identity. Who are you when you stop being what everyone needed you to be? This isn't the question you were supposed to ask, not now, not after all these years. You were supposed to keep going, keep building, keep achieving, keep performing. And for a long time, that worked perfectly well. You built a life that looked good on paper, maybe even felt good for a while. You played the roles society handed you, the employee, the parent, the spouse, the provider, the responsible one. You wore the masks that helped you fit in, succeed, survive. And you wore them so well that somewhere along the way, you forgot you were wearing them at all. But now something's shifted, hasn't it? Now the masks don't fit the way they used to. They feel heavy, suffocating, like clothes that once fit perfectly but now constrict every movement. And the life you built, the one you worked so hard for, sacrificed so much for, feels strangely hollow, like a beautiful house with no one living inside. You did everything right, followed all the rules, checked all the boxes. So why does it feel so wrong? Here's the truth no one tells you. The emptiness you're feeling isn't failure, and it isn't a sign that something's broken in you. It's something else entirely. It's a call, your soul, your true self, the person you were before you learned to become what others needed, has been waiting quietly in the background of your life. It's been patient, accommodating, understanding. But now it's done waiting. It's no longer satisfied with the roles you play or the masks you wear. It wants something deeper, something more honest, something real. It wants you. A long time ago, a psychologist named Jung noticed something strange happening to his patients around midlife. These were people who had spent decades building successful lives, and yet they found themselves restless, lost, deeply dissatisfied in ways they couldn't quite explain. And Jung realized this wasn't a problem that needed fixing. It was a transition, a natural shift in the psyche that he called the second half of life. The moment when your soul stops focusing on building outward and starts demanding that you turn inward. The first half of life is about adaptation, about becoming what the world needs you to be. But the second half is about something entirely different. It's about integration, about becoming who you actually are. This book isn't about fixing you, because you're not broken. It's about understanding what's happening to you and why it's not a crisis, but an awakening. It's about the roles you've played for so long that you forgot they were roles. The parts of yourself you've hidden away because they didn't fit the life you were building, and the person you're finally ready to become, now that the masks are starting to fall. You'll hear stories throughout these pages of people who stood exactly where you're standing now. Sarah, who at 47 woke up one morning and realized she'd been living someone else's dream for the past 2 decades. David, who at 52 let go of the military identity he'd built his entire life around and discovered that freedom was waiting on the other side of his fear. Michael, who at 58 finally understood that all the success in the world doesn't mean anything if it's hollow at the center. These people didn't have a roadmap. and they didn't know what to do. But they found their way through, and so will you. This book won't give you a checklist or promise you a quick transformation. What it will give you is something more valuable: clarity. A way to understand what you're feeling, a language for what you're going through, and permission to let go of who you were supposed to be so you can finally become who you actually are. Because here's the thing: the life you built isn't the life you need. And that's not a tragedy. It's the beginning of something you've been waiting for your whole life without realizing it. The masks are falling away. The roles are dissolving. And underneath all of it, there's someone waiting to be met. Someone you've never fully known. Someone who's been there all along, beneath the noise and the expectations and the endless doing, waiting patiently for you to stop and finally look. The question is, are you ready to meet them? If you are, keep listening. Because your story, your real story, is about to begin. Chapter 1. The roles you've played and why they no longer fit. You know the feeling, don't you? That strange moment when you're in the middle of doing something you've done 1,000 times before. Sitting in a meeting, making dinner, responding to an email. And suddenly, for reasons you can't quite explain, it feels like you're watching someone else go through the motions. The words coming out of your mouth sound rehearsed. The smile on your face feels painted on. And the person everyone's interacting with doesn't quite feel like you. It feels like you're performing a role in a play you never auditioned for, reading lines someone else wrote. And the costume you've been wearing for decades has started to feel unbearably tight. This isn't burnout, though it might feel like it. This isn't depression, though the emptiness can be just as real. This is something else entirely, something deeper and more existential. It's the moment when the roles you've been playing, the employee, the parent, the spouse, the provider, the responsible one, stop fitting the way they used to. And you're left wondering, if I'm not these roles, then who am I? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The roles you've been playing were never really you. They were masks you put on to survive, to succeed, to belong. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who spent his life studying the human psyche, called this your persona, the face you show to the world. It's not fake, exactly. It's more like a protective shell, a version of yourself you created to meet the world's expectations. And for a long time, it worked perfectly. The persona helped you navigate social situations, build a career, maintain relationships, raise children. It helped you fit in. But here's what Jung also understood. The persona was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a bridge, not a destination. And now the bridge is crumbling, and you're standing in the middle of it, wondering what happens next. Sarah was 47 when she woke up one morning and realized she had no idea who she was anymore. She'd spent the last 25 years building what everyone called a successful life. She was a senior marketing director at a tech company, the kind of person who ran meetings with confidence, made decisions without hesitation, and always seemed to have everything under control. At home, she was the capable one, the one who managed schedules, planned vacations, kept everything running smoothly. Her kids were in college now, her marriage was stable, her career was thriving. On paper, her life looked perfect. But that morning, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she didn't even remember making, Sarah felt something she'd been pushing down for years finally break through the surface. Emptiness. It wasn't that she hated her job or her life. It was that none of it felt like hers anymore. The confidence she projected at work, it felt performative, like a mask she put on every morning along with her business suit. The capable, organized version of herself at home. It felt like a character she'd been playing for so long she forgot there was anyone underneath. She looked at her calendar. Meetings, deadlines, obligations, more meetings, and felt a wave of exhaustion that had nothing to do with being tired. She was exhausted from performing, from being the version of herself everyone expected her to be. And the question that terrified her most wasn't, "What do I do now?" It was, "Who am I when I stop doing all of this?" But here's what Sarah didn't understand yet, and what you might not understand either. That emptiness she was feeling wasn't a sign that something was wrong with her. It was a sign that something was finally waking up inside her. In Jungian psychology, there's a concept that explains what was happening to Sarah and what might be happening to you. Jung believed that in the first half of life, we focus on building and adapting. We learn to fit into the world, to meet its demands, to become what's expected of us. We develop a persona, a social mask, that helps us succeed. And that's not a bad thing. The persona is necessary. It helps us function in society, build careers, form relationships. But Jung also noticed something crucial. Around midlife, the psyche naturally begins to shift. The things that mattered in the first half of life, external achievement, social approval, fitting in, start to feel hollow. And the persona, the mask you've been wearing for decades, starts to feel suffocating. This isn't failure. This is what Jung called the beginning of individuation. The process of becoming who you actually are, not who you've been pretending to be. Think about it. How many versions of yourself have you created over the years? There's the professional you, the one who shows up to work, speaks the language of your industry, knows how to navigate office politics. There's the parental you, the one who puts everyone else's needs first, who sacrifices sleep and time and personal desires to make sure everyone else is okay. There's the social you, the one who knows how to make small talk, how to be charming at parties, how to keep relationships smooth even when you're exhausted. There's the responsible you, the one who pays bills on time, makes rational decisions, keeps everything running. And then there's the you underneath all of that, the one you've barely met, the one who's been waiting patiently for decades, hoping you'd finally turn around and ask, "What do you want? What do you need? Who are you when no one's watching?" The reason the roles don't fit anymore isn't because you've failed at them. It's because your soul, your true self, is done waiting. It's done being ignored. It's done with the performance. And it's demanding, sometimes loudly, sometimes through quiet desperation, that you finally pay attention. Here's what makes this so hard. Letting go of the roles feels dangerous. Because if you're not the capable professional, the devoted parent, the reliable spouse, the responsible adult, then who are you? The roles have been your identity for so long that the thought of living without them feels like stepping off a cliff into nothing. But here's the truth that no one tells you. The nothing isn't emptiness. It's space. Space for something new. Space for something real. Space for you. This doesn't mean you have to quit your job, abandon your responsibilities, or blow up your life. It means you have to start asking a question you've been avoiding. Who am I beneath the roles I play? And it means you have to be willing to sit with the discomfort of not having an immediate answer. Sarah didn't have an answer either, not at first. But she started asking the question. She started paying attention to the moments when the mask slipped, when she felt something authentic trying to break through. She started noticing the things that made her feel alive versus the things she was doing out of obligation. And slowly, carefully, she started making space for the person she'd been ignoring for 2 decades. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden transformation. But it was real. And it was the beginning of something she didn't even know she'd been missing. Herself. So here's the question for you. What roles have you been playing? And more importantly, what part of you has been waiting underneath them, hoping you'd finally stop performing and start being? Because the roles don't fit anymore for a reason. They were never meant to be your final form. They were meant to get you here, to this moment, to this question, to this choice. The choice to keep performing, or the choice to finally meet the person you've never fully known, the person who's been waiting all along. Chapter 2. The life you built versus the life you need. You wake up one morning, look at the life you've built and realize something strange. It's not yours. Not really. Oh, you built it. You spent decades making decisions, working hard, sacrificing, planning, executing. But somewhere along the way, the life you were building stopped being the life you wanted and became the life you thought you were supposed to want. You followed the script. Go to school, get the job, build the career, buy the house, raise the kids, save for retirement. You did everything right. And yet, when you sit in the silence of your perfectly constructed life, you feel like a stranger in your own home. Because the life you built was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a foundation. But you stayed so focused on building that you forgot to ask the most important question. What am I building this for? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never face. The life that got you here won't get you where you need to go. Because the first half of life demands one thing: adaptation. You learn to fit into the world, to meet its expectations, to become what it needs you to be. And that's not a failure. That's survival. But the second half of life demands something different. It demands that you stop adapting to the world and start listening to yourself. And that shift, from external success to internal meaning, is where most people get stuck. Elena was 49 when she finally admitted something she'd been avoiding for years. She'd spent her entire life living for other people. She'd been the good daughter, the devoted wife, the selfless mother, the dependable friend. Every decision she made, every choice, every sacrifice, was shaped by one question: what do they need from me? And for a long time, it worked. She was loved, appreciated, needed. But as her kids grew up and her marriage settled into routine, Elena started feeling something she'd never allowed herself to feel before. Resentment. Not anger, exactly. Just a quiet, persistent ache that whispered, "When is it my turn?" She'd built a life that everyone admired. Her family was happy, her home was warm, her relationships were strong. But none of it felt like hers. She couldn't remember the last time she'd made a decision based on what she wanted instead of what everyone else needed. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done something just for herself, something that served no purpose other than her own joy. And the worst part? She didn't even know what she wanted anymore. She'd spent so long being what others needed that the person underneath, the real Elena, had become a stranger. But here's what Elena didn't understand yet. The resentment she was feeling wasn't a sign that she'd failed. It was a sign that her soul was finally asking to be heard. Carl Jung understood this conflict better than most. He noticed that in the first half of life, people naturally orient themselves toward what he called the collective, the expectations, values, and demands of society. You learn what success looks like, what a good life is supposed to be, what roles you're supposed to play. and you shape yourself to fit that mold. But Jung also noticed something crucial. Around midlife, the psyche naturally begins to rebel against the collective. It stops caring about what society thinks and starts demanding that you live according to your own truth. He called this shift individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, not who you've been conditioned to be. And here's the hard part. Individuation doesn't ask for your permission. It doesn't wait until you're ready. It shows up as a crisis, as restlessness, as resentment, as the nagging sense that the life you've built isn't the life you need. And it forces you to choose. Keep living for the collective, or finally start living for yourself. Elena spent years trying to ignore that choice. She told herself it was selfish to want more, ungrateful to feel dissatisfied when she had so much. She doubled down on being what everyone needed, more devoted, more selfless, more accommodating. But the resentment didn't go away. It grew. And eventually, it turned into something she couldn't ignore. Exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind of exhaustion that comes from living a life that doesn't belong to you. And one day, in a moment of desperate honesty, she asked herself a question she'd been avoiding for decades. What do I actually want? The answer didn't come immediately. When you've spent your whole life living for others, your own desires become so buried you can't even find them. But Elena started small. She started saying no to things that drained her. She started carving out time for herself, even if she didn't know what to do with it. She started paying attention to the moments when she felt alive versus the moments when she felt like she was just going through the motions. And slowly, carefully, she started hearing a voice she hadn't heard in years. Her own. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't leave her family or blow up her life. But she stopped living as if everyone else's needs mattered more than hers. She started making choices that served her, not just everyone around her. She took a pottery class she'd been thinking about for years. She started saying no to obligations that felt like performance. She let herself be imperfect, uncertain, messy. And for the first time in decades, she felt something other than resentment. She felt like herself. Here's what makes this shift so difficult. We're conditioned to believe that living for ourselves is selfish, that putting our own needs first means abandoning the people we love. But Jung understood something profound. You can't truly give to others if you're empty. And you'll always be empty if you're living a life that doesn't belong to you. The life you built for everyone else might look perfect on the outside. But if it's hollow at the center, it's not sustainable. Eventually, the resentment wins. The exhaustion wins. And you're left with nothing, not for them, not for you. Individuation isn't about abandoning your responsibilities or becoming selfish. It's about understanding that the life you built in the first half, the life shaped by external expectations, was necessary. But it's not the final destination. The second half demands something different. It demands that you stop asking, "What do they need from me?" and start asking, "What do I need from myself?" So here's the question. What life are you living? Is it the life you chose, or the life you thought you were supposed to choose? Is it shaped by your truth, or by the collective's expectations? And if it's the latter, what would happen if you finally gave yourself permission to ask, "What do I actually want?" Elena's answer came slowly. It wasn't a single revelation. It was a series of small permissions, small choices, small moments of honesty. And what she discovered was this. The life she needed wasn't radically different from the life she'd built. It just needed to make room for her. for the version of herself that had been waiting patiently in the background, hoping someone would finally ask, "What about you?" Because that's the shift the second half of life demands. Not destruction or abandonment. Just the courage to finally ask what you want. And the willingness to build a life that actually makes room for the answer. Chapter 3. The Shadow. You've been avoiding. There are parts of yourself you've spent your whole life keeping hidden. Not the parts you're ashamed of, necessarily, but the parts that didn't fit. The parts that were too messy, too emotional, too selfish, too wild, too uncertain. Too much of whatever the world told you wasn't acceptable. So you buried them. You learned to present the version of yourself that worked, the responsible one, the rational one, the strong one, the appropriate one. And for a long time, that was enough. But here's the problem with burying parts of yourself. They don't disappear. They wait. And eventually, usually around midlife, they stop waiting quietly. They start demanding to be seen. And when you refuse, they show up in ways you can't ignore. Through restlessness, through anger, through dreams you can't shake, through the nagging feeling that something essential is missing from the life you've so carefully built. Carl Jung called this the shadow. The parts of yourself you've rejected, repressed, or hidden away because they didn't fit the image of who you were supposed to be. And here's what makes the shadow so uncomfortable. It's not just the bad parts of you. It's every part that didn't get permission to exist. The creativity you suppressed because it wasn't practical. The vulnerability you hid because it wasn't strong. The wildness you tamed because it wasn't appropriate. The anger you swallowed because it wasn't polite. The shadow is everything you've decided you're not allowed to be. And it's been following you your whole life, waiting for the moment you'd finally turn around and look. Michael was 58 when the shadow he'd been avoiding for decades finally caught up with him. He'd spent his entire adult life building a business, and he'd built it well. He was a successful entrepreneur, disciplined, strategic, driven. People admired his focus, his ability to make hard decisions, his refusal to let emotions get in the way of logic. He'd built an empire by being rational, by staying in control, by never allowing himself to be distracted by anything that didn't serve the bottom line. And it worked. The business thrived, the money came, the respect followed. But somewhere along the way, Michael stopped feeling anything. Not sadness, not joy, not excitement, not even satisfaction. He was numb, and the more successful he became, the more hollow he felt. At first, he dismissed it as stress or exhaustion. But then the dreams started. Strange, vivid dreams, where he was painting, something he'd loved as a teenager but abandoned when he went to business school. In the dreams, he was covered in color, surrounded by chaos, completely absorbed in creating something that had no purpose, no profit, no logic. And when he woke up, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Longing. Not for success or money or accomplishment, but for the part of himself he'd left behind when he decided that creativity was a luxury he couldn't afford. But that part of himself hadn't disappeared. It had just been living in the shadows, waiting for permission to exist again. Jung believed that the shadow contains not just the parts of ourselves we consider negative, but also the parts we consider impractical, irrational, or socially unacceptable. For Michael, the shadow wasn't anger or violence or darkness. It was creativity. It was spontaneity. It was the part of him that wanted to make something beautiful for no reason other than the joy of making it. But in a life built on efficiency and profit, that part didn't fit. So he buried it. And for 30 years, it lived in the background, quietly aching, quietly calling, quietly insisting that there was more to him than the rational, strategic businessman he'd become. The shadow, Jung explained, isn't your enemy. It's the part of your psyche that holds everything you've disowned in order to fit into the life you've built. And the longer you ignore it, the more power it gains. It shows up in projection. When you judge others for being too emotional, too impulsive, too creative, you're often judging the parts of yourself you've buried. It shows up in compulsion, the inexplicable urges, the restlessness, the feeling that you need to do something, but you don't know what. It shows up in dreams, in fantasies, in the parts of your life that feel like they're happening to someone else. And eventually, if you ignore it long enough, it shows up as a crisis. Not because the shadow is trying to destroy you, but because it's trying to save you from a life that's only half lived. Michael resisted the dreams for months. He told himself it was ridiculous, that he was too old to start painting again, that he didn't have time, that it didn't make sense. But the longing didn't go away. It got stronger. And one day, on a whim he couldn't explain, he walked into an art supply store, bought a canvas and some paints, and set them up in the corner of his office. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't make a plan. He just started painting. And for the first time in decades, he felt something other than numbness. He felt alive. It wasn't perfect. The paintings were messy, chaotic, unprofessional. But they were his. And in the act of creating them, he wasn't the businessman, the strategist, the rational decision maker. He was the person he'd left behind 30 years ago. The person who made things not because they were profitable, but because they were meaningful. The person who allowed himself to be uncertain, to experiment, to fail, to play. The person his shadow had been protecting all along. Here's what makes integrating the shadow so difficult. It requires you to embrace the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime rejecting. It requires you to admit that the version of yourself you've been presenting to the world isn't complete. It requires you to give permission to the messy, impractical, irrational, emotional parts of yourself that don't fit into the neat identity you've constructed. And that feels dangerous. Because if you let the shadow out, who knows what will happen? Who knows what you'll become? But here's the truth. The shadow isn't asking you to become someone else. It's asking you to become whole. To stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable, good and bad, appropriate and inappropriate. To stop performing a version of yourself that fits everyone's expectations and start living as the full, complicated, contradictory human being you actually are. This doesn't mean indulging every impulse or abandoning all discipline. It means acknowledging that the parts of yourself you've been suppressing are just as real, just as valid, just as essential as the parts you've been performing. It means asking, what part of myself have I been refusing to see? And what would happen if I finally let it exist? For Michael, integrating the shadow didn't mean quitting his business or abandoning logic. It meant making space for the parts of himself that logic had buried. It meant allowing himself to be both the strategist and the artist, the rationale and the creative, the disciplined and the spontaneous. It meant understanding that he didn't have to choose between success and meaning. He could be both, but only if he stopped pretending that half of himself didn't exist. Jung called this process shadow integration, and he believed it was one of the most essential tasks of the second half of life. Because in the first half, you succeed by becoming what the world needs. But in the second half, you only find fulfillment by becoming what you need. And that requires meeting the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Not with judgment, not with shame, but with curiosity and compassion. So here's the question. What part of yourself have you buried? What did you decide years ago that you weren't allowed to be? Was it the emotional part, the playful part, the uncertain part, the creative part, the vulnerable part, the angry part? What part of you has been living in the shadows, waiting for permission to finally exist? Because the shadow isn't your enemy. It's your ally. It's the keeper of everything you've lost along the way. And it's not trying to destroy the life you've built. It's trying to show you that there's more to you than the version you've been performing. More depth, more richness, more truth. And the only way to find it is to stop running and finally turn around. Chapter 4. When should no longer works. There's a word that's been running your life for decades, and you might not even realize it. It's a small word, quiet and unassuming, but it has more power over you than almost anything else. That word is should. You should go to college. You should get a stable job. You should get married. You should buy a house. You should have kids. You should save for retirement. You should be responsible. You should be strong. You should be happy. You've spent your entire life following a list of shoulds that someone else wrote. And you never stop to ask the most important question. Says who? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of the life you've built wasn't built by you. It was built by the shoulds, by the expectations society handed you, the rules your parents taught you, the script everyone agreed was the right way to live. And for a long time, following the shoulds worked. It gave you direction, structure, a sense of purpose. But now the shoulds feel like a prison. You look at your life and realize you're living according to someone else's rules, someone else's values, someone else's definition of success. And the person you were supposed to become, the one the shoulds promised you'd be if you just followed them, feels nothing like the person you actually are. Robert was 49 when his marriage ended, and with it, the last should that had been holding his life together. He'd done everything right. He married young, built a stable career, bought the house, had the kids, played the role of the dependable husband and father. He followed every rule, met every expectation, lived the life he was supposed to live. And then one day, his wife sat him down and said the words that shattered everything. I don't think you've ever been happy. And the worst part? She was right. Robert had spent 30 years living a life shaped entirely by shoulds. He should be a good provider, so he stayed in a job he hated because it paid well. He should be a responsible father, so he sacrificed his own interests to focus on his kids. He should be a stable husband, so he stayed in a marriage that had stopped feeling like a partnership years ago. He never stopped to ask what he wanted. He never questioned whether the life he was building was the life he needed. He just kept following the shoulds, assuming that if he did everything right, happiness would follow. But it didn't. Because happiness doesn't come from following someone else's rules. It comes from living according to your own truth. And Robert had spent so long following the shoulds that he'd forgotten he even had a truth. After the divorce, Robert was lost. Not because he missed the marriage, he didn't, not really, but because without the shoulds, he had no idea who he was. The structure that had been holding his life together was gone, and all that was left was a man who'd spent decades performing a role instead of living a life. He didn't know what he wanted, what he enjoyed, what mattered to him. He only knew what he should want. And that wasn't enough anymore. But here's what Robert didn't understand yet. The collapse of the shoulds wasn't a failure. It was a liberation. Carl Jung understood this tension better than most. He noticed that in the first half of life, people naturally orient themselves toward what he called the collective unconscious, the shared values, expectations, and beliefs of society. You learn what a good life looks like according to the collective, and you shape yourself to fit that mold. You follow the shoulds because they give you a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than yourself. But Jung also noticed something crucial. The collective's values are not your values. They're universal, impersonal, designed to keep society functioning. But they have nothing to do with who you are as an individual. And around midlife, the psyche naturally begins to rebel. It stops caring about what the collective thinks and starts demanding that you live according to your own values, your own desires, your own truth. Jung called this shift individuation, the process of separating from the collective and becoming yourself. And it's not optional. The psyche will force the issue whether you're ready or not. It will show up as restlessness, as dissatisfaction, as the nagging sense that the life you're living doesn't belong to you. And it will keep pushing until you finally stop and ask, what do I actually want, independent of what I've been told I should want? Robert spent months avoiding that question. He told himself he was too old to start over, that he'd already wasted too much time, that it was too late to figure out who he was supposed to be. But the question didn't go away. And eventually, in a moment of desperate honesty, he admitted something he'd been avoiding for years. He had no idea what he wanted. All he knew was what he didn't want. He didn't want to keep living for other people. He didn't want to keep following rules that had nothing to do with him. He didn't want to keep pretending that the shoulds were enough. So he stopped. He stopped asking what he should do and started asking what he wanted to do. And the difference was staggering. It wasn't that his life changed overnight. It was that for the first time in decades, the choices he made felt like his. He left the corporate job he'd hated for years and started freelancing, something he'd always dismissed as irresponsible. He moved to a smaller apartment, something he would have considered a failure by the collective standards, but that actually made him feel lighter. He started spending time with people who accepted him as he was, instead of people who expected him to be what he should be. And slowly, carefully, he started feeling something he hadn't felt in years, like himself. Here's what makes letting go of the shoulds so difficult. It feels like betrayal, like you're abandoning the people who taught you those rules, or letting down the version of yourself you were supposed to become. But here's the truth. The shoulds were never about you. They were about survival, about fitting in, about not rocking the boat. And they served a purpose. In the first half of life, they helped you navigate a world that didn't care who you were as long as you played your role. But the second half of life demands something different. It demands that you stop performing and start living. And that means letting go of the shoulds that have been running your life and asking the question you've been avoiding. What do I want? Independent of what anyone else thinks I should want. This doesn't mean you abandon all responsibility or structure. It means you start making choices based on your values, not the collective's. It means you stop living according to someone else's script and start writing your own. It means you finally give yourself permission to want what you want, even if it doesn't fit the mold of what you were supposed to want. Robert's answer came slowly. He didn't wake up one day with perfect clarity about who he was or what he wanted. But he stopped letting the shoulds make his decisions for him. He started paying attention to what made him feel alive versus what made him feel like he was just going through the motions. He started making choices that served him, not the collective's expectations. And for the first time in decades, his life started to feel like his. So here's the question. What shoulds have been running your life? What rules are you following that you never chose? And more importantly, what would happen if you finally stopped and asked, what do I actually want if I ignore every should I've ever been taught? Because the second half of life doesn't care about the shoulds. It only cares about the truth. And the truth is this: you can't become who you're meant to be if you're still living according to someone else's rules. The shoulds got you here, but they won't get you where you need to go. That requires something different. That requires you to finally start living for yourself. Chapter 5. The True Self You've Never Met. There's a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who am I when no one's watching? Not the version of yourself you present at work, not the role you play at home, not the mask you wear in social situations, but the person underneath all of that. The one who exists in the quiet moments, in the thoughts you don't say out loud, in the truths you've learned to swallow. That person is still there, waiting. And if you've spent decades performing for others, midlife has a way of forcing the confrontation. Because the roles are cracking, the masks are slipping. And for the first time in years, you're getting glimpses of someone you barely recognize. The person you've always been, but never had permission to be. Carl Jung spent much of his career exploring this concept, and he gave it a name: the self, not the ego, which is the part of you that interacts with the world, performs roles, and meets expectations. But the self with a capital S, the deeper, truer core of who you are. Jung believed that the first half of life is about building the ego, adapting to the world, becoming functional. But the second half is about something entirely different. It's about meeting the self. And that meeting, Jung warned, is rarely comfortable. Because the self doesn't care about your accomplishments, your reputation, or how well you've performed. It only cares about one thing: whether you're living as yourself or as someone else's idea of who you should be. Grace was 67 when she finally stopped pretending. For most of her life, she'd been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts, who kept conversations polite, who made sure everyone around her felt comfortable. She never raised her voice. She never challenged anyone. She learned early that being agreeable made life easier, that saying what people wanted to hear kept relationships intact. And for decades, it worked. She had friends, a loving family, a quiet life. But as she entered her late 60s, something inside her began to shift. The things she used to tolerate, the passive-aggressive comments, the family dynamics, where everyone pretended everything was fine, the constant performative politeness, started feeling suffocating. It wasn't that she was suddenly angry. It was that she was tired. Tired of biting her tongue. Tired of protecting everyone's feelings except her own. Tired of living as if honesty was dangerous. And one day, at a family dinner where everyone was playing their usual roles, Grace did something she'd never done before. She told the truth. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cruel, but it was honest. And the silence that followed was deafening. Her daughter had made a comment, one of those small, cutting remarks disguised as concern. And instead of smiling and nodding the way she always did, Grace looked at her and said, "That hurt my feelings, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't." The room froze, because in 67 years, Grace had never said anything like that. She'd never pushed back. She'd never named what everyone knew, but never acknowledged. And in that moment, something cracked open, not just in the room, but inside her. Jung understood this shift. He called it the emergence of the self, the moment when the parts of you that have been silenced, suppressed, or hidden for the sake of social harmony finally demand to be seen. The self doesn't emerge gently. It doesn't wait for permission. It shows up as a disruption, as an uncomfortable truth, as a refusal to keep performing. And when it does, the people around you will react. Because when you stop playing the role they've assigned you, it forces them to look at the roles they've been playing too. After that dinner, Grace's family didn't know what to do with her. Some of them were hurt, some were confused. Some accused her of changing. But Grace wasn't changing. She was finally becoming. For the first time in her life, she was allowing herself to exist as more than the version of herself that made everyone else comfortable. She was allowing herself to have opinions, to express discomfort, to take up space in ways she'd never permitted herself before. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the old Grace, the one who smoothed everything over, begged her to go back to being agreeable. There were nights when she lay awake wondering if she'd ruined relationships by speaking up. But every time she told the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Alive. Not happy necessarily, but real, authentic, whole. Here's what makes meeting the self so difficult. It requires you to let go of the identity you've spent a lifetime building. The version of yourself you present to the world isn't fake exactly. It's real, but it's incomplete. It's the part of you that learned to adapt, to perform, to keep the peace. And for a long time, that was enough. But the self doesn't accept incompleteness. It demands wholeness. It demands that you stop dividing yourself into acceptable and unacceptable, polite and impolite, safe and dangerous. It demands that you integrate all the parts of yourself you've been keeping hidden, the parts that don't fit, the parts that challenge, the parts that refuse to stay quiet. Jung called this process individuation, and he believed it was the central task of the second half of life. Not success, not achievement, but the painful, beautiful work of becoming whole, of meeting the parts of yourself you've been avoiding and finally giving them permission to exist. Not as a secret, not as something you save for when you're alone, but as an essential part of who you are. Grace didn't have a roadmap. She didn't know what would happen if she kept speaking her truth. But she kept doing it. She started saying no to invitations she didn't want to accept. She started expressing opinions she'd been hiding for decades. She started letting herself be seen as someone who had edges, who had boundaries, who wasn't always easy or agreeable. And yes, some relationships shifted. Some people pulled away. But the ones who stayed, they saw her differently. Not as the peacekeeper, but as a person. Whole, complex, real. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The self doesn't care about your reputation. It doesn't care about keeping everyone happy or maintaining the image you've carefully constructed. It only cares about whether you're living authentically. And if you're not, it will make you feel it. Through restlessness, through resentment, through the nagging sense that no matter how much you've achieved, something essential is missing. Because it is. The person you've been performing isn't the person you are. And the gap between those two things, the persona and the self, is what's been aching inside you all along. So here's the question. Who are you when no one's watching? Who are you when you strip away the roles, the expectations, the need to keep everyone comfortable? Who are you when you let yourself speak the truths you've been swallowing for decades? Grace didn't have all the answers, but she started asking the question. And in the asking, something shifted. She stopped living as if everyone else's comfort mattered more than her own truth. She stopped dividing herself into the version people liked and the version she kept hidden. She started living as a whole person, And for the first time in 67 years, she felt like herself. Because that's what the self demands. Not perfection, not clarity. Just the courage to finally meet the person you've been avoiding. The person who's been waiting patiently beneath all the roles, all the performances, all the polite silences. The person who's always been there, hoping you'd finally turn around and ask, "Who are you?" And the answer, when it comes, isn't a revelation. It's a recognition of someone you've always known, but never had permission to be. Chapter 6. The Fear of Letting Go. The hardest part of transformation isn't knowing what you want. It's letting go of what you don't. You can see the life you need on the other side of the bridge, but you can't cross it without leaving something behind. And what you're leaving behind isn't just habits or routines or obligations. It's the identity you've spent decades building. The version of yourself that worked, that succeeded, that kept you safe. And even when that identity is suffocating you, even when you know it's not who you really are, the thought of letting it go feels like stepping off a cliff into nothing. Because here's the truth most people refuse to face. Holding on hurts, but letting go is terrifying. And fear, more than anything else, is what keeps people trapped in lives that no longer fit. Maria was 51 when she finally admitted something she'd been avoiding for years. She wanted to leave her job. Not for another job. Not for a promotion or a change of scenery. She wanted to leave the entire career she'd built for 28 years. It wasn't that she hated it exactly. It was that it had stopped feeling like hers. Every morning, she woke up with a knot in her stomach. Every meeting felt performative. Every success felt hollow. She'd spent nearly 3 decades climbing a ladder only to realize, standing at the top, that it was leaning against the wrong wall. But the thought of leaving paralyzed her. Because if she wasn't the executive, the professional, the person who had her life together, then who was she? And more terrifyingly, what would people think? Her friends, her family, her colleagues. They all saw her as successful, stable, someone who had it figured out. If she walked away from that, what would they say? That she'd failed? That she'd wasted all those years? That she'd given up? The fear wasn't just about losing the job. It was about losing the version of herself that everyone knew. And that version, suffocating as it was, at least made sense. It was familiar. It was safe. And letting it go meant stepping into the unknown with no guarantees, no roadmap, and no assurance that the person waiting on the other side was someone she could even recognize. Carl Jung understood this fear better than most. He noticed that people approaching midlife often face what he called the fear of annihilation. The terror that if you let go of the identity you've been performing, there will be nothing left. You've spent so long being the role, the mask, the persona, that you can't imagine who you'd be without it. And so you cling to it, even when it's killing you. Because the fear of the unknown is more powerful than the pain of the familiar. But Jung also understood something else. The fear isn't warning you away from danger. It's warning you that you're on the edge of something real. The self, the true core of who you are, doesn't reveal itself gently. It forces its way through. And the only way to meet it is to let go of the illusion you've been holding on to. Not because the illusion was wrong, but because it was never meant to be permanent. Maria spent months frozen in that fear. She told herself she was being practical, that she needed to wait for the right time, that she couldn't just walk away from decades of work. But the truth was simpler. She was terrified. Terrified of what would happen if she let go. Terrified of who she'd be without the title, the salary, the structure. terrified that the person underneath all of that, the real Maria, wasn't enough. And then one day, something shifted because she realized something that changed everything. She was already losing herself. Holding on wasn't protecting her. It was erasing her. Every day she stayed in that job, in that identity, she was choosing the mask over the person underneath. And the mask, no matter how successful, no matter how impressive, wasn't her. And it never would be. So she let go. Not dramatically, not with a grand announcement or a burnout-fueled exit. She gave her notice, quietly, calmly, and walked away from the life she'd spent 3 decades building. And the fear didn't disappear. It followed her. It whispered that she'd made a mistake, that she'd thrown away everything, that she'd regret it. But something else happened too. Something she hadn't expected. She felt lighter. Not happy, exactly, but free. Free from the performance. Free from the constant effort of being someone she wasn't. Free to finally ask the question she'd been avoiding her entire adult life. What do I actually want? Here's what makes letting go so difficult. We're wired to believe that identity is fixed, that who we've been is who we are, that changing means failing. But Jung understood something profound. Identity isn't fixed. It's fluid. The person you were in your 20s isn't the person you are in your 50s. And the person you are in your 50s isn't the person you're meant to become. The roles you played in the first half of life, the achiever, the provider, the responsible one, were necessary. They helped you survive, succeed, build a life. But they were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to be a foundation. And at some point, if you want to keep growing, you have to be willing to let them go. Maria didn't have a plan when she left her job. She didn't know what she'd do next, what her life would look like, who she'd become. But for the first time in years, she wasn't living in fear of the future. She was living in curiosity. And that shift, from fear to curiosity, changed everything. She stopped asking, "What will I lose?" and started asking, "What might I find?" The answer didn't come immediately, but slowly, carefully, she started rebuilding. Not a new career, not a new version of the old identity, but a life that felt like hers. She traveled. She read. She spent time with people who saw her as more than her job title. She let herself be uncertain, messy, undefined. And for the first time in decades, she felt like herself. So here's the question. What are you holding on to that's keeping you from becoming who you're meant to be? What identity, what role, what version of yourself are you clinging to because letting go feels too terrifying? And more importantly, what would happen if you finally let yourself trust that the person on the other side of that fear is worth meeting? Because here's the truth Jung knew. You're not losing yourself when you let go. You're finding yourself. The version of you that's been waiting beneath the roles, beneath the masks, beneath the fear. The version that's always been there, hoping you'd finally be brave enough to let everything else fall away. Chapter 7. You're not lost. Your shedding Angela was 46 when everything she thought she knew about herself stopped making sense. For 2 decades, she'd been the friend everyone leaned on. The one who showed up, who listened, who fixed problems, who made everyone else feel better. It wasn't a role she chose consciously. It was just who she became. And for a long time, being that person felt meaningful. It felt like purpose. But somewhere around her mid-40s, something shifted. She started feeling resentful. Not toward any one person, but toward the version of herself that had spent 20 years giving and never asking for anything in return. And then the confusion set in. If she wasn't the person everyone leaned on, then who was she? If she stopped being the helper, the fixer, the emotional support system, what was left? She didn't know. And not knowing terrified her. Because without that role, she felt like she was disappearing, like she was losing herself, like she was drifting with no anchor, no direction, no sense of who she was supposed to be. But what Angela didn't understand yet was this. She wasn't losing herself. She was finding herself. The confusion wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of growth. Because the person she'd been for 20 years, the helper, the fixer, the one who put everyone else first, wasn't the whole truth of who she was. It was a version. A necessary version, maybe. But not the final one. And the only way to become the person she was meant to be was to let that version go. To shed it. To make space for something truer, deeper, more whole. Jung called this process psychological death and rebirth. And he didn't mean it metaphorically. He meant that in order to grow, parts of you have to die. Not physically, but psychologically. The identities, the roles, the beliefs that got you through the first half of life have to fall away so that the self, the true integrated core of who you are, can emerge. And that falling away feels like loss. It feels like confusion. It feels like you're disintegrating. But you're not. You're transforming. Angela spent months in that confusion. She stopped answering every call, stopped showing up for every crisis, stopped being the person everyone expected her to be. And the discomfort was intense. Because without the role, she didn't know how to relate to people. She didn't know what she had to offer if it wasn't fixing their problems. She felt useless, purposeless, lost. But slowly, something else began to emerge. She started noticing what she actually wanted. Not what people needed from her, but what she needed for herself. She started saying no. She started setting boundaries. She started letting herself be imperfect, uncertain, unavailable. And the person who emerged on the other side? She wasn't the helper. She wasn't the fixer. She was someone more complex, more honest, more real. Someone who cared about people but didn't sacrifice herself to prove it. Someone who could be present without being responsible for everyone's happiness. Someone who finally understood that her worth wasn't tied to how much she gave. Here's what makes shedding so disorienting. It doesn't come with instructions. There's no map, no timeline, no clear sense of what you're supposed to do while it's happening. You just have to sit in the uncertainty and trust that something is being rebuilt, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. And that trust, that willingness to let the old version die without knowing what the new version will be, is one of the hardest things a person can do. But here's the truth. You can't skip this part. You can't shortcut your way to the new identity. The shedding has to happen. The confusion has to be felt. The disorientation has to be endured. Because the person you're becoming can't exist if the person you've been is still taking up all the space. And the only way to make room is to let go. Not all at once, not with perfect clarity, but slowly, carefully, one layer at a time. So here's the question. What version of yourself are you shedding? What role, what identity, what way of being is no longer serving you? And more importantly, what would happen if you stopped fighting the confusion and started trusting that it's not a sign of being lost? It's a sign that you're finally becoming found. Angela didn't have all the answers, but she stopped looking for them. She stopped trying to figure out who she was supposed to be and started letting herself exist in the uncertainty. And in that space, the space between who she'd been and who she was becoming, she found something she'd been searching for her whole life. herself. Not the version people needed, not the version that fit the mold, but the version that was real. Because that's what shedding is. It's not loss, it's liberation. And the person waiting on the other side? That's not someone new. That's who you've always been, finally given permission to exist. Chapter 8. The people who won't understand. One of the hardest truths about personal transformation is this: not everyone will come with you. In fact, most people won't. Because when you start changing, when you stop playing the role they've assigned you, when you start setting boundaries, when you start living authentically instead of performing, it makes them uncomfortable. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your transformation forces them to look at their own lives. And if they're not ready to change, they'll try to pull you back. Not out of malice, necessarily, but out of fear. Fear that if you change, the relationship will change. Fear that if you stop being who they need you to be, they'll lose you. Fear that your courage to live authentically will highlight their unwillingness to do the same. And here's the part no one tells you. Some relationships won't survive your transformation. And that's not a failure. That's part of the process. The first time someone you love tells you they don't recognize you anymore, it feels like betrayal. You've spent months, maybe years, working to become more yourself, more honest, more authentic, more whole. And the people closest to you act as if you've committed a crime. They say things like, "What happened to you?" or "You've changed." And they don't mean it as a compliment. They mean it as an accusation. As if change itself is proof that you've failed them. As if staying the same, no matter how suffocating, was the only way to prove your loyalty. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The people who are most upset by your transformation are often the ones who benefited most from your performance. They liked you better when you were agreeable, when you put their needs first, when you didn't challenge them, when you didn't ask for more. They didn't see you as a person. They saw you as a role. And now that you're refusing to play it, they're angry, not because you've done something wrong, but because you've disrupted the dynamic that worked for them. And they don't know how to relate to you as a whole person instead of a function. Carl Jung noticed that individuation, the process of becoming yourself, often creates conflict in relationships. Because most relationships, especially long-term ones, are built on unconscious agreements. You play this role, I'll play that one. You meet my needs, I'll meet yours. And for a while, it works. But when one person starts growing, starts shedding the old roles, the agreement breaks down. And the other person has a choice: grow with you or resist. And resistance, Jung knew, is far more common than growth. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. A friend who used to call you constantly suddenly stops reaching out. A family member who used to confide in you now keeps their distance. A partner who used to rely on you for emotional support suddenly accuses you of being selfish. They don't say, "I'm uncomfortable with your growth." They say, "You're different," and not in a good way. They frame your transformation as your problem, when really, it's theirs. Because they're not ready to do the work you're doing. And your willingness to do it anyway makes them feel exposed. James was 54 when he realized that his oldest friendship was built on a lie. Not a deliberate one, but a lie nonetheless. For 30 years, he and Mark had been best friends. They met in their 20s, built their careers together, raised families at the same time, navigated life's ups and downs side by side. But somewhere around his 50s, James started changing. He left his corporate job. He started questioning the values he'd spent decades living by. He started prioritizing time over money, meaning over success, authenticity over approval. And Mark? Mark didn't understand any of it. At first, Mark tried to be supportive. He listened when James talked about his new perspective, nodded along when James explained why he'd left his career. But as the months passed, the support turned into skepticism. Mark started making comments, small digs disguised as concern. Are you sure you're not having a midlife crisis? Don't you think you're being a little reckless? What if you regret this? And eventually, the skepticism turned into anger. You're not the person I used to know, Mark said one night over drinks. I don't even recognize you anymore. James tried to explain. He tried to tell Mark that he wasn't disappearing, he was finally becoming. But Mark didn't want to hear it, because Mark wasn't upset that James had changed. He was upset that James had changed in a way that challenged the life Mark was still living. Mark was still climbing the ladder, still chasing success, still defining himself by external achievement. And James's willingness to walk away from all of that felt like a judgment, like a rejection of everything Mark had built his life around. And so the friendship ended. Not with a fight, exactly, but with silence. They stopped calling, stopped meeting for drinks, stopped being part of each other's lives. And for a long time, James felt like he'd failed, like he'd lost something irreplaceable. But eventually, he realized something crucial. The friendship hadn't ended because he changed. It had ended because the relationship was built on who he used to be, not who he was becoming. And Mark didn't want to meet the new version. He wanted the old one back. And that wasn't something James could give him. Here's what makes this so painful. When relationships end because of your transformation, it feels like proof that you've done something wrong. Like you've become selfish or arrogant or disconnected. But the truth is more complicated. Some relationships are meant to last a lifetime, and some are meant to last for a season. And when you outgrow a relationship, it doesn't mean you've failed. It means you've grown. And not everyone can grow with you. Jung believed that individuation often requires what he called the withdrawal of projections. In other words, you have to stop being what people project onto you and start being who you actually are. And when you do that, the people who relied on the projection will resist. Because they didn't sign up for a relationship with the real you. They signed up for a relationship with the version of you that met their needs. And when that version disappears, so does the foundation of the relationship. This doesn't mean you abandon everyone. It doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you accept that some people won't understand. And you stop waiting for their approval. You stop trying to justify your transformation. You stop apologizing for becoming yourself. Because the people who are meant to stay in your life, they'll meet you where you are. They'll be curious instead of critical. They'll ask questions instead of making accusations. They'll say, I don't fully understand, but I trust you. And those are the relationships worth keeping. So here's the question. Who in your life is resisting your transformation? Who's trying to pull you back to who you used to be? And more importantly, are you willing to let them go if they can't accept who you're becoming? Because here's the truth Jung knew. You can't become yourself and keep everyone happy. You have to choose. And the people who truly love you, they won't make you choose. They'll grow with you. Or they'll step aside and let you go. But they won't try to shrink you back down to fit the box they built for you. Chapter 9. What you leave behind isn't lost. There's a shift that happens when you stop measuring your life by what you've achieved and start measuring it by what you've become. For most of the first half of life, success is external. It's the job title, the salary, the house, the recognition, the things you can point to and say, "Look what I built." And for a long time, that feels like enough. But somewhere around midlife, the question changes. It's no longer, "What have I accomplished?" It becomes, "What have I given? What have I created that will outlast me? What will remain when I'm gone?" Carl Jung believed that this shift was one of the most profound transformations of the second half of life. He called it the movement from the ego to the self, from accumulation to contribution, from building a life to leaving a legacy. And he didn't mean legacy in the traditional sense, monuments, achievements, things carved in stone. He meant something deeper. He meant the imprint you leave on the people you touch, the wisdom you pass on, the way you change the world simply by being fully yourself. But here's what makes this shift so difficult. It requires you to let go of the metrics that defined you for decades. It requires you to stop chasing external validation and start asking whether the life you're living actually matters. Not to the world, to you. For years, Daniel measured his life in milestones. Graduated, promoted, married, kids, house, retirement account. Every box checked, every goal achieved, every expectation met. And by the time he reached 60, he'd built a life that looked successful by every conventional standard. But when he sat down and asked himself what it all meant, what he'd actually contributed, what would remain after he was gone, he couldn't come up with an answer. Because he'd spent so long accumulating that he'd forgotten to ask what any of it was for. It wasn't that his life was meaningless. It was that it was incomplete. He'd built a structure, but he'd never stopped to ask what he was building it to hold. And now, standing at 60 with decades of achievement behind him, he realized that none of it felt like legacy. It felt like performance, and performance, no matter how impressive, dies with you. Jung understood this crisis. He noticed that people in the second half of life often experience what he called the confrontation with mortality, not the fear of death, but the recognition that time is finite. And that recognition forces a question. What am I doing with the time I have left? Not what am I achieving, but what am I contributing? What am I creating that will outlast my body, my career, my accomplishments? What will remain when everything else falls away? Daniel didn't have an answer. But the question wouldn't leave him alone. It followed him into every meeting, every conversation, every quiet moment. And eventually, it forced him to do something he'd never done before. Stop building and start giving. He started small. He began mentoring younger colleagues, not because it looked good on a resume, but because he actually had something to offer. He started volunteering at a community center, teaching skills he'd spent decades accumulating. He started having deeper conversations with his kids, not about their achievements, but about their struggles, their fears, their hopes. And slowly, he started to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Useful. Not in the transactional, career-driven way, but in a way that felt permanent. Like he was planting seeds that would grow long after he was gone. Here's what Jung knew. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you give while you're here. It's not the monuments or the achievements. It's the moments, the conversations, the wisdom passed on, the lives you touch simply by being present, by being real, by being yourself. And those things don't die. They ripple. They continue. They become part of the people you've touched. And those people pass them on. And the chain continues long after you're gone. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You can't create that kind of legacy by performing. You can only create it by living authentically. Because people don't remember what you achieved. They remember how you made them feel. They remember the truth you told, the courage you showed, the way you gave them permission to be themselves by being yourself first. Daniel didn't become a different person. He didn't abandon his career or his accomplishments, but he stopped measuring his worth by them. He started asking a different question. Not, what have I built? But, who have I helped become? Not, what do I have? But, what have I given? And that shift, from accumulation to contribution, changed everything. Because it gave his life something he'd been searching for his entire adult life. Meaning. Jung believed that the second half of life is about preparing for death. Not in a morbid way, but in a meaningful one. It's about looking at the life you've lived and asking whether it was yours. Whether you spent it accumulating or contributing. Whether you left the world and the people in it better than you found them. And that work, Jung knew, can't be done through performance. It can only be done through presence. So here's the question. What are you leaving behind? Not when you die, but right now. In every conversation, every interaction, every moment. Are you performing or are you contributing? Are you accumulating or are you giving? And more importantly, when you're gone, what will remain? Because here's the truth Jung understood. The life you build for yourself dies with you. But the life you give to others, that continues, that ripples, that becomes part of something larger than yourself. And that, more than any achievement, any title, any milestone, is what legacy actually means. Daniel didn't know how much time he had left. None of us do. But he stopped living as if he had forever to figure it out. He started living as if every moment mattered. As if every conversation was a chance to give something real. As if the life he was living wasn't just for him, but for everyone he touched. And in doing that, he stopped chasing success and started creating something that would outlast him. Not a monument, but a presence, a wisdom, a way of being that others could carry forward. Because that's what legacy is. Not what you leave behind when you're gone, but what you give while you're here. Chapter 10. Start now, not when you're ready. Most people spend their lives waiting for the right moment. The moment when they feel confident enough, prepared enough, certain enough to finally start living as themselves. They tell themselves they'll make the change when the timing is better, when they have more clarity, when they know exactly how it will turn out. But that moment never comes. Because readiness isn't something you wait for. It's something you create by starting. You've spent this entire book reading about people who transformed their lives. Sarah, who walked away from the version of herself everyone expected. Elena, who stopped living for others and started living for herself. Michael, who faced the parts of himself he'd been hiding. None of them felt ready. They started scared, uncertain, without knowing how it would turn out. And that's exactly why they succeeded. They didn't wait for permission. They gave it to themselves. So here's the question. What are you waiting for? What permission do you think you need before you're allowed to start living authentically? And what would happen if you stopped waiting and took one small, honest step right now? You don't need a plan. You don't need certainty. You just need to start. With one conversation, one boundary, one truth, one choice that reflects who you are instead of who you've been pretending to be. Start by saying no to something you've been tolerating. Start by saying yes to something you've been denying yourself. Start by admitting, out loud or just to yourself, that the life you've been living isn't the life you need. It won't be easy. You won't feel ready. But you'll feel something you haven't felt in years. Alive. Real. Whole. The life you're meant to live isn't waiting for someday. It's waiting for now. And the only question left is this. Are you going to keep waiting? Or are you going to start? Take one step, just one, and trust that the readiness you've been waiting for will come not before you start, but because you did. Conclusion. You made it to the end. That alone says something important. You're done waiting. Maybe you don't feel ready. Maybe you're still scared. But you're here. And something has shifted. The restlessness you've been feeling isn't failure. It's awakening. The disorientation, the confusion, the sense that the life you've been living no longer fits. Those are signs that you're finally becoming yourself. This book isn't about fixing you. You're not broken. It's about meeting the person you've always been beneath the roles, the expectations, the performance. The second half of life isn't about achieving more. It's about becoming whole. And that work doesn't wait for someday. It starts now, with one choice, one boundary, one truth. You don't need to figure everything out. You just need to start. And trust that the person you're becoming will emerge not because you had all the answers, but because you finally stopped waiting and began. So begin now. Because the life you've been postponing isn't waiting for someday. It's waiting for you.